The West. Essential question. Why did Americans settle the Great Plains and the Far West? In this lesson, we will analyze the following three items: Indian policies, the cattle industry boom, the causes and effects of westward expansion, and we will evaluate the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. The last American frontier. The American frontier was the line separating settled areas from unsettled wilderness. It was the dividing line between Native American land and land settled by more technologically advanced people. The settlement of the West was spurred by the lure of precious metals. The California gold rush of 1848 and 1849 attracted more than 300,000 people from the U.S. and abroad. In 1896, a gold nugget found near the Klondike River in the Yukon Territory, Alaska, spurred the Klondike gold rush. However, only 30,000 out of the 100,000 gold seekers made it all the way up. The discovery of other precious metals allowed for the settlement of the West. For example, gold and silver was found in Alaska, the Rocky Mountains, and the Black Hills of North Dakota. Thousands of settlers moved to these areas. In fact, mining towns sprung up overnight in many of these areas. However, these areas were already settled and people already lived there, namely the Native Americans. And so we see the beginning or the increase of Indian wars against settlers. Tensions increased as Union troops were stationed in forts along the frontier after the Civil War. Further conflict erupted after gold was discovered in the Black Hills of Dakota, and the Sioux Native Americans were asked to move from their sacred ground. In the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse defeated General George Custer and killed 264 American soldiers. As a result, Crazy Horse was then captured and killed, and most of the Sioux were forced onto reservations. The Indian Wars culminated in the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, in where U.S. soldiers slaughtered more than 300 unarmed Sioux men, women, and children with machine guns. The impact of the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The benefits of the Transcontinental Railroad included reduced journey time from New York to San Francisco. It reduced the journey from 6 months to 10 days, and it also enabled settlement of the West and shipments of crops to eastern markets. The Transcontinental Railroad impacted Native Americans. Tracks often ran through Native American territory, and so sharpshooters traveling by train destroyed herds of buffalo in the Great Plains. This affected the Plain Indians' ability to remain on the plains, seeing as the buffalo was one of their main food sources. The availability of cheap land was another reason settlers moved westward. The Homestead Act of 1862 was signed by President Lincoln, and it stated that any citizen could occupy 160 acres of government land, so as they made improvements on the land, such as building homes, growing crops, and then would be able to own the property after 5 years. The Homestead Act attracted many settlers, specifically many European immigrants. Another effect on westward expansion was the cattle industry. Longhorn cattle. Several million cattle roamed the Great Plains in Texas. Texans drove cattle north to railroads in Kansas, where they would then be shipped to slaughterhouses in Chicago, and the meat would be shipped east to cities. The journey to drive cattle north to the Kansas railroads was known as cattle drives, and it generally took about 3 months to complete. It crossed Indian territory, and it allowed cattle to graze on grasses on the open range. Cowboys dominated the cowboy industry. Cowboys learned to ride, rope, and brand cows from Mexican vaqueros. They became a romanticized symbol of American individualism. In fact, Western music celebrates cowboy life. Most, however, led a lonely, isolated life, and 1 in 5 of these cowboys was African American. Overgrazing destroyed much of the grass in the plains, and as such led to a decline in the cattle industry. Sheep herders and farmers bought and fenced land with barbed wire, and extreme weather killed millions of cattle. Settlement on the west took on the form of farming. Occupation of the Great Plains was realized through the Homestead Act and railroads, which enabled farmers to move west. About half of these settlers were European immigrants. The other half were children of farmers from the East and Midwest. Farming on the Great Plains. Many of these farmers faced hostility of Indians and cattlemen. These initial hardships forced many cattlemen to form associations and hired men to attack homesteaders. The army, along with barbed wire and large numbers of farmers, helped overcome these threats. Further hardship regarding farming on the Great Plains were natural obstacles. Railroad companies used to advertise and promoted a well-watered, wooded lands on the Great Plains. Farmers, however, found little rainfall, few trees, tough soil, extreme temperatures, plagues of grasshoppers, and personal isolation. Some of these farmers starved or returned east, and those who stayed endured hours of heavy work and long cold winters. Farmers that stayed on the Great Plains relied on technological ingenuity. They ended up building sod houses from clumps of grass and soil to make up for the lack of trees. They used barbed wire to keep animals off their farms. They also utilized steel plows to turn the soil, and drilling equipment was used to dig deep water wells and windmills. Harvesters and threshers reduced the amount of workers needed on large farms. Another effect of westward expansion dealt with Native Americans. Many of the Native Americans lost control of the West. They were forcefully removed from their lands. In addition, flood of settlers as a result of the Homestead Act and the railroads occupied their land. Many of these Native Americans were defeated by government in Indian wars, and their natural environment was destroyed in the process. Native Americans were forcefully removed from their land, and many were sent to reservations. The reservations is where land were usually smaller than their original land and consisted of mostly undesirable land. Many times, the federal government fell through on their promises of providing food, blankets, and seeds. Furthermore, the Dawes Act of 1887 forced the Americanization of Native Americans. The Dawes Act abolished all tribes and sold their tribal lands. It also granted private land to each family and forced them to farm. In addition, it promised citizenship and the right to vote to those who complied. Problems arose with the Dawes Act. For one, Native American culture was threatened. Second, farming was required once the land was given. But oftentimes these tribes were hunters, not farmers. In addition, these Native Americans were often given infertile land and no equipment or instruction for farming. And as such, people on reservations suffered from malnutrition, poverty, and health issues. In 1924, the American Indian Citizenship Act replaced the Dawes Act, and it granted immediate citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. The American Indian Citizenship Act did not require for Indians to give up their tribal lands and or their customs.